Well, gosh, what a week it has been. Seriously, particularly for those in the news media with, still a bit of a shock announcement, the demise of Newshub. And, certainly some commentators have said this isn't just bad news for news media, this is bad news for democracy. Somebody who I'm sure has an opinion on this is Director of the Democracy Project, Dr. Bryce Edwards. He joins us on the program. Bryce, kia ora, good morning.
Morena, Andrew. Yes, on the Newshub issue, very sad for me. I mean, I'm a big user of Newshub.
Yep.
Go use their politics reporting, analysis, and information every day. I often appear on Newshub too, actually,
Yep.
over the years. And yes, I do think such platforms are just vitally important to help an informed public be able to participate in politics. So, yeah, it's absolutely unfortunate when these big news organizations go under, and frankly, it won't be the last.
Yeah, yeah.
We're in an age of huge upheaval, and the advertising model of some of these news organizations has fallen apart.
Yep.
And so the future of news and broadcasting and media in general is more along the lines of Radio Rhema,
Yeah.
frankly. It's about more niche and specialized media that are supported by their audience,
Yep.
essentially. People that are willing to pay either compulsorily through getting subscriptions or voluntarily
Yep.
through supporting something that they have some trust in. And that's no doubt how I presume Rhema manages to keep the lights on.
That's the miracle continues 40 years on from that one. And hey, organisations such as Democracy Projects, other independent journalists may pick up the slack in that regard. Wanted to talk to you, though, about the political responses and reactions to the announcement. A little bit underwhelming from Melissa Lee, especially initially.
Yeah, so she's the new Minister of Broadcasting, and she sort of has downplayed the significance of Newshub going, as has the Prime Minister.
Yep.
And I think it's mostly because they want to deflect having to take action or take the blame on this. And I guess I have some sympathy for them on that, because there's not a lot that the state can really do about a major private company like this going under. In the past, we've seen, banks maybe going under, or finance companies, I think, or even aluminium smelter, and
Yeah.
the government doing good deals for them. But I think it's a very dangerous thing for the governments to do. And right now, we've got a bit of a fiscal crisis for this current government.
Yep.
So there's not a lot they can do. There's a bit of I think you're about to say they could be progressing the digital deal with the likes of Google, Facebook, and so forth.
Yep.
I think that's very contentious, that one, and I'm not sure it is the answer to make Facebook and Google and Microsoft pay for these big things. I'm not sure it's really going to work out.
My point was actually going to be, I'm not sure it's necessarily a good thing if all of the media in New Zealand are financially dependent upon the government and the current politicians who are in play. I think we've seen that, if anything, that's likely to erode public confidence in independent media. The one comment I thought was very interesting, though, Winston Peters, who has been, banned from, despite being the Deputy Prime Minister and the acting Prime Minister in the last 24 hours, it actually made some positive comments, talked about what a sad day it was for democracy with the demise of Newshub. Surprising position from Winston, I thought.
Yeah, he's also kind of using the demise to, push some of his own, I guess, policies or critiques of the media, which I think are very valid, especially about the public journalist taxpayer fund that some broadcasters and media have got in the past. But it's always a very tricky thing when taxpayers give money for the media. I mean, I think we've come to a situation where we expect public broadcasting, and we expect to, fund things like RNZ, TVNZ, but even that sometimes can be problematic. And in the past, the history of broadcasting in lots of countries, including New Zealand, is where the state has kind of pressured those broadcasters to toe the public line and help the government out. But now we're seeing it when money is given to private media, that there might be some strings attached. So it always has to be very carefully, thought through.
Let's look at some other things that the government is spending money on, or perhaps not spending money on. A bit embarrassing for our Prime Minister. He was supposed to go to Australia. The Air Force plane was basically grounded on the runway. He missed some important meetings. Of course, it hit the headlines. The Aussies are having a great laugh at our expense, at the high calibre of our military, but there's according to Judith Collins, there's no money in the jar. We're not going to be getting any new planes soon.
Yeah, so the background here is that traditionally heads of government, ministers in most countries, when they go to international meetings, the state normally has some sort of defence force planes or otherwise that sends them around the world. And of course, New Zealand's Defence Force planes are about 30 years old,
Yep.
and that was when they bought them secondhand. They have been they're aged and they need replacing. But of course, there's been a reluctance by successive governments to really do that, and especially to be seen as spending money on themselves to fly around in luxury. But I think on this topic, I really would agree very strongly with Christopher Luxon, or at least the 2023 version of him, when he campaigned and said, ministers and prime ministers should just take commercial planes, and they shouldn't rely on the defence forces. But once he's got into power, unfortunately, he has relied on a defence force plane. So he was supposed to fly to Melbourne yesterday, I think it was.
Yep.
And once him and his team and all the media got onto the plane, it wasn't cleared. There were some faults. So they then had to cancel that flight. And he did travel, I think, on Air New Zealand or another commercial flight to get there. He got there late. It was embarrassing. But if he just kept with his original sort of promise and booked a commercial flight in the first place, it wouldn't have been a problem.
Exactly, and well, glad to know we've still got some mates at Air New Zealand to get a last minute upgrade in that regard. That would be embarrassing enough, but honestly, it's not the most embarrassing thing that our Prime Minister's had to deal with this week, and it's only Wednesday. Housing perks, basically a mortgage-free house that he owns, that he was living in his own house that he wasn't paying a mortgage on, and yet to the taxpayer were paying a significant sum for the privilege of him living in his own house. It wasn't against the rules, but it was certainly a bad look.
Yes, it really was a bad look. So all politicians, all elected parliamentarians do get an allowance for living in Wellington if they're not already resident in Wellington.
Yep.
So if you're a Wellington MP, you don't get any allowance, but if you're anyone from outside of the area, you get paid some sort of costs for the year. And for ministers and prime ministers, it's a much higher amount. So I think for a backbench MP, it's about $32,000 a year allowance. A minister, about $45,000. For a prime minister, they can claim up to $52,000. Of course, in the past, for the last 30 or 40 years, prime ministers have lived in Premier House, in a very old sort of mansion on Tinakori Road near the Beehive. But in the case of Premier House, it's been, as with the Air Force planes, it's been neglected, hasn't really had enough maintenance. And so recent prime ministers before Luxon started to say, hey, we need to spend some more money doing up this place. It's falling apart. But they didn't want to because it would be a bad look. And so it's come to Luxon, and he's decided he doesn't want to live there for at least in the meantime, until some decisions are made about doing up Premier House. So he's living in his own apartment, and being a very wealthy man, he owns 7 properties around the country. And so he already owns his Wellington apartment, and he's got no mortgage on it. So he just has continued to receive his accommodation allowance as he's entitled to, like he says. But it's a very bad look
Yeah.
at a time when the government is cutting back on things for him to be claiming such a large amount. And so the optics have not been good. Um, but I mean, you can have some sympathy for him. He's only doing what other ministers are also doing. It's just that he happens to be a very wealthy man.
Yeah.
He doesn't exactly need that money.
And certainly a week where there's conversations about spending money to upgrade the mansion, or perhaps a shiny new New Zealand version of Air Force One is not going to go down well with the voters. Hey, Bryce, appreciate your commentary as always. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Andrew.